everyone for being here. It's an honor to speak to you. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we are standing on Aboriginal land and acknowledge their elders, past, present and future. I'm going to make it relatively short. I've got 4 things to say. The first is a little bit about my story. A lot of you know who I am. There's nothing unique about my story. I am one of about 7 million people, Palestinians, refugees, who are scattered all around the world. I was born in a refugee camp. My parents were raised in the refugee camp. My father, my grandfather, my grandmother, my auntie all died in the refugee camp, having never seen their siblings. 2 of their siblings were left in Palestine in 1948. Israel never allowed a single person to return to their homes. We have a cousin of my grandfather that was shot in 1948 as he tried to go back to Palestine. Israel was created after the Nakba. 1948, 75% of Palestinians became refugees. It's now over 70 years, and it's time that that injustice gets corrected. Enough of refugees. We call upon the Australian government to reverse its recent decision to cut funding of $10 million for the UN Refugee Council. The second point that I would like to mention is, from a historical perspective, Australia has a very important moral sense of responsibility to why the situation that we find ourselves in. 70 years later, Israel was created, yet Palestine is still under occupation. Back in 1948, as the chair of the United Nations Council was an Australian, a former Labor of the Labor Party, who was sitting in the chair that allowed the creation of the State of Israel. And yet today, Australia still doesn't recognize Palestine as a state. Australia is one of few countries that still doesn't recognize Palestine as a state. There's 137 countries that recognize Palestine as a state. Last week was the last South American country that recognized Palestine as a state. There are 16 European countries that recognize Palestine as a state. Over 85% of the populations of the world are represented by countries that recognize Palestine as a state. Why is Australia still a laggard, waiting for the masters in Washington to recognize Palestine? We call upon our government to act, and act now. Briefly, the third thing, I think we are all aware of the dire situation of Gaza. Gaza's been under blockade for 11 years, and the world silent, shameful, no action. It's time for the blockade to end, but not just the blockade. There's not a week that goes by that there's no bombing and death and destruction of people and properties in Gaza. On average, 3 Palestinian children are brutally killed, extrajudicially killed by Israel. Every single week, 3 Palestinian children are murdered, and the world and the media and the government are silent. Only yesterday, one of only 2 entertainment centers in Gaza, 2 cinemas are in Gaza, one of them was destroyed yesterday, the cultural center. Shame on Israel for destroying it. But as a testament to the Palestinian spirit, 2 hours after the destruction, the Palestinian students who learned music in that center hold a concert on the rubble to show that we will not go away, we will not be silenced. Our culture is alive and we will continue to be there. The last thing I want to say is, after we leave here, It's fantastic that we're here, and I'd love to see more people here. It's fantastic that we're going to march. Please, don't forget about Palestine when you leave here. We need to take action. We need to do things. I encourage you to speak to your local member of parliament. Even better, to join the local branch, whether the Greens or the Labour or even the Liberals, God forbid. Please speak to your member of parliament and tell him to do something, to break the silence. Not one member of our parliament has said a single word against this new racist Israeli law that we enacted. We have always known that Israel is a racist state built on racism. Now the veil has been lifted off. It is obvious to the world that Israel is implementing racist policies. 750,000 Jewish-only settlers live on occupied Palestinian land in settlements. The occupation wall that is dividing Palestinian land is being expanded every week. But now it's enshrined in Israeli law that Jews are to be treated differently to Christians like myself or Muslims like my cousins. Shame on you, Israel. Shame on our parliament for not saying a single word. So please, take action, join up, march, demand